Some promises are made in whispers, others are forged in the howling wind of a Dakota winter, where every breath is a fight, and survival is a prize you have to win every single day. For 2 years, Delilah Marsh had been fighting. She was 30 years old, but grief had carved decades into her face, leaving her with nothing but grit and the muscle memory of swinging an axe. Her husband, Thomas, had frozen to death in the mountain pass, and since then, her world had been shrinking. Her homestead was crumbling around her. Her pantry was a hollow echo of what it once was, and winter was coming, not like a gentle blanket of snow, but like a predator stalking the weak. She was alone, chopping firewood with hands that had long forgotten what it felt like not to ache when salvation arrived. It came in the form of a man so large he seemed to block out the sun, a cowboy who stood nearly 7.5 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a barn door and hands that could just as easily break a horse's neck as they could cradle a fallen sparrow. His name was Ephraim Cutter, and he didn't speak in whispers. He took one look at her, at the desperation she tried so hard to hide, and he made a vow. It was a promise so shocking, so utterly insane, it should have sent her running. "By winter," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very ground she stood on, "you'll have my son growing inside you." But when a woman's heart has been frozen solid by loss, can even the most powerful promise hope to melt the ice? The October wind was a blade, slicing through Delilah Marsh's worn woolen shawl, a cruel reminder of the winter that was racing towards her. At 30, she knew promises were fragile things, easily broken and scattered like dead leaves across the endless prairie. Her hands, calloused and raw, gripped the axe handle tighter. She swung, and the crack of splitting oak was a small, satisfying victory against the crushing silence of her life. 2 years. 2 years since they found Thomas up in Eagle's Pass, frozen solid, his hands still clutching the reins of their old mare. The horse had made it home. Thomas never did. His wedding ring now hung on a chain around Delilah's neck, a cold piece of gold that tapped against her breastbone with every swing, a constant metallic heartbeat reminding her of everything she'd lost, and everything she was about to lose. The homestead, once their shared dream, now felt like a monument to her failure. The roof leaked in 2 places, painting rusty tears down the walls she'd once whitewashed with so much hope. The barn door sagged on broken hinges. A fox had stolen half her chickens last month. Every sunrise brought new evidence of her losing battle against the wilderness. And yet, every morning, she rose before the sun to fight it all over again. Her closest neighbor, Martha Henley, lived 3 miles to the east. Martha and her husband Carl were good people. They'd offered help more times than Delilah could count, but their charity felt like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. Taking that basket of preserves last month had left her feeling the weight of their pity for weeks. Pride was a bitter meal, but sometimes it was all a person had left. The sound of hoofbeats made her stop. She straightened up, shielding her eyes against the pale, unforgiving sun. A rider was approaching from the north, moving with an easy confidence that spoke of a life lived in the saddle. As the figure grew closer, Delilah felt her breath catch. Even from a distance, the man's size was staggering. It was Ephraim Cutter. He sat his massive stallion not like a man, but like a king surveying his kingdom of grass and sky. Stories followed him like his own shadow. They said he could lift a full-grown steer with his bare hands. They said he'd walked 50 miles through a blizzard to deliver medicine to a dying child. They said he spoke to horses in a language only they could understand. The whispers in town were wild. Some said he had giant's blood in his veins, a throwback to the old country where myths walked the earth. Others claimed he was part Indian, though his hair was the color of autumn wheat and his eyes were the pale, sharp blue of a winter sky. Everyone agreed on one thing. Ephraim Cutter was a man apart. He'd arrived 3 weeks ago, staying at the boarding house in town, asking questions about available land. The town's fathers had practically thrown their daughters at him, but he'd shown no interest in the giggling girls with their ribbons and Sunday dresses. The older women had started to whisper that maybe he wasn't the marrying kind. But now he was here, on her land, and Delilah was suddenly, painfully aware of her patched dress and the stray strands of hair escaping her bun. She set the axe down, wiped her hands on her apron, and waited. He dismounted with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a man his size. He was even bigger up close, a mountain of a man who made the world around him seem small and fragile. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, removing his hat. His hair caught the sunlight like spun gold. His voice was deep and measured, each word chosen with care. "Mr. Cutter." She nodded, keeping her distance. "I can't offer much in the way of hospitality." His eyes went from the axe to the meager pile of split wood at her feet. "Looks like you're preparing for winter." "Every day is preparation out here," she said, her voice tight. She saw him taking in the sagging porch, the cracked window panes, the weed-choked garden. She saw the pity in his eyes that she hated so much. But when she looked again, it wasn't pity. It was something else entirely, something that made her pulse quicken. "A person does what they must," she said, forcing the words out. "Indeed they do," he said, taking a step closer. She had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. His pale blue eyes were searching her face, looking for something. "I've been watching you, Mrs. Marsh." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Sir, I don't think—" "Not like that," he said quickly, his huge hands nervously turning the brim of his hat. It was a gesture so at odds with his imposing frame that it was almost comical. "Not like a man watching a woman he means to take advantage of. I've been watching like a man watches someone he respects. You've been working this land alone for 2 years. You're still here. That takes a strength most people can't even imagine." The unexpected praise felt like a slap. Tears pricked her eyes, hot and sharp. Whether from gratitude or sheer exhaustion, she couldn't say. "Strength doesn't fix a leaking roof or fill an empty pantry, Mr. Cutter." "No," he agreed, his voice softening, "but it's the foundation everything else is built on." He paused, and the silence stretched, thick with unspoken things. "I came here to make you an offer, Mrs. Marsh, not the kind of offer a woman usually gets from a stranger, but these aren't usual times, and I'm not a usual man." She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden chill cutting through her despite the sun. "What kind of offer?" He took another step closer, and his shadow fell over her. He smelled of pine and leather and cold, clean air. "The kind that might save us both from spending another winter alone." The words hung in the air, a crazy, impossible promise. She stared at him, at this giant of a man who spoke of salvation as if it were a simple transaction. He was offering her a lifeline, but every lifeline has a price, and Delilah had a terrible feeling she was about to find out what it was. His words hit her like a physical blow, a marriage proposal, from a man she'd never spoken to before today. It was madness, the kind of thing that happened in penny dreadfuls, not in the harsh, unforgiving reality of the Dakota frontier. "Mr. Cutter, she stammered, her mind reeling. "I'm 34 years old, Mrs. Marsh," he said, his voice direct and leaving no room for misunderstanding. "I have land up in the high country, good land, water rights, timber. I have money in the bank. I have skills enough to keep a family fed and warm through the worst winter. What I don't have is a wife." He paused, his pale blue eyes boring into hers. "And what you don't have is security. The heart?" She let out a laugh, a bitter, humorless sound. "My heart is buried in the cemetery next to the church, Mr. Cutter. What's left of me is just a woman trying to survive until spring." "Maybe that's enough to start with," he said, his expression unreadable. He put his hat back on, settling it at a thoughtful angle. "I'm not asking you to love me, Mrs. Marsh. I'm asking you to let me take care of you, to let me fix your roof and fill your pantry, to let me stand between you and the winter." The practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive for 2 long years, was screaming at her to say yes. Security, protection, an end to the grinding loneliness that gnawed at her soul every single night. "And in return?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What do you want in return?" "The one thing my money can't buy," he said, his gaze unwavering. "And what's that?" "A family." The word hung between them, a bridge to a world she thought she'd lost forever. "I want children, Mrs. Marsh. I want to leave something behind in this world besides stories about a giant who lived in the mountains. You're young enough. You're strong. You could give me sons." There it was, the price of her salvation. It wasn't just her hand in marriage. It was her body, her future. He wanted to fill her empty home and her empty life, but he also wanted to fill her womb. The bluntness of it should have horrified her. Instead, a strange, practical calm settled over her. It was a bargain, a trade, her fertility for her survival. But another part of her, the part that still clutched Thomas's ring, recoiled. How could she replace him? How could she let another man into her life, into her bed? I need time," she managed to say. "I need to think." "Of course." He nodded, a gesture of respect. "But winter's coming, Mrs. Marsh, whether we're ready for it or not. I'll be in town for another week, at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house. You know where to find me when you have an answer." He turned to mount his horse, his movements fluid and powerful. But before he could ride away, she heard herself call out, "Mr. Cutter?" He turned in the saddle, his eyebrows raised. "Why me?" she asked, the question bursting out of her. "There are younger women in town, prettier women, women with families and dowries." A slow smile spread across his face, the first genuine expression of warmth she'd seen. It transformed his rugged features, making him look almost boyish. "Because when I watched you split that wood," he said, his voice dropping low, "I didn't just see a widow struggling. I saw a woman who refuses to break. That's worth more than all the dowries in the Dakota Territory." And with that, he was gone, leaving her standing in her yard, with an axe at her feet, and a decision that felt like it weighed more than the world itself. She sank onto the porch steps, her hands shaking too badly to work. She pulled the gold band from under her dress, holding the cold metal in her palm. "What do I do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty, wind-swept prairie. "What do I do?" The wind kicked up, carrying the scent of snow from the distant mountains, but for the first time in 2 years, the thought of winter didn't fill her with pure terror. Somewhere in town, a giant of a man was waiting. And for the first time since Thomas died, Delilah Marsh had something that felt terrifyingly like hope. But as the days passed, that hope began to curdle into something else. Fear. The town was a hornet's nest of whispers. Ephraim Cutter, the mysterious giant, had proposed to the widow Marsh. The news spread like wildfire, and every trip to the general store became an ordeal. She could feel the eyes on her, the mix of pity, envy, and outright disbelief. The giggling girls he'd ignored now looked at her with pure venom. The older women, the town's self-appointed guardians of propriety, clucked their tongues and whispered about desperation and foolishness. They saw a desperate woman making a reckless choice. They weren't wrong. 3 days after his proposal, she woke to a sight that made her blood run cold. He was there, on her porch, sitting on the top step as if he owned the place. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, but his presence cast a long, dark shadow over her home. In his massive hand, he held a gold pocket watch, its surface gleaming in the early light. He looked up as she opened the door, his expression calm, yet utterly determined. "Mrs. Marsh." He rose to his feet, a towering figure that blocked out the dawn. He closed the watch with a soft, final-sounding click and slipped it into his vest. "I hope you'll forgive the early hour." "You've been waiting long?" she asked, pulling her shawl tighter, suddenly conscious of her bare feet on the cold floorboards. "Long enough to watch the sun come up," he said. He gestured to the horizon. "It's a good place to raise children." His directness stole her breath. He wasn't here for small talk. He was here for his answer. "Mr. Cutter, I know you haven't decided yet," he interrupted, stepping closer. The scent of pine and cold air clung to him. But I need to tell you something. Something that might help you make up your mind. He pulled the watch from his pocket again, holding it out for her to see. The gold casing was covered in intricate engravings, strange symbols she didn't recognize. "This was my grandfather's," he said, his voice low and serious. "He came from Norway when he was just a boy. He carried this watch through 40 years of farming, through droughts and blizzards, through the death of 2 wives and the raising of 6 children. He told my father it wasn't just for telling time. It was to remember that every moment matters, especially the ones that shape the future." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "My father carried it for 30 years. The day he died, he pressed it into my hand. He told me not to give it away until I found a woman I was ready to give my name to. A woman I was ready to build something with, something that would last." The implication was as heavy and solid as the man standing before her. He wasn't just offering her a marriage of convenience. He was offering her his legacy. "And you think I'm that woman?" she whispered. "I think you're a woman who understands that time isn't something to be wasted," he said, his gaze intense. "I'm 34 years old, Mrs. Marsh. I've spent too many years waiting, watching you these past weeks, seeing you fight for what's yours when the odds are stacked a mile high against you. That told me everything I needed to know." "You barely know me," she protested, but her voice was weak. "I know you rise before the sun to tend to animals that are half-starved. I know you mend your own fences and patch your own roof, even when the work is too much for one person. I know you've been wearing the same dress for 3 days because you only have 2 that aren't patched beyond repair." His voice was gentle, but the words were a stark reminder of her poverty. "And I know you loved your husband enough to still wear his ring 2 years after he died." She instinctively touched the chain at her throat. "Love doesn't die just because a person does." "No, it doesn't," he agreed. "But life goes on, whether we're ready or not." He pocketed the watch, and his expression grew serious, almost grim. "I'm not asking you to forget him, Mrs. Marsh. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you build something new." What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Marriage," he said plainly. "Partnership. A future where you don't have to worry if you'll have enough wood to keep from freezing to death." He paused, and his next words were a hammer blow of intent. "I'm proposing that by winter you'll have my son growing inside you, and by spring you'll have a family again." The raw, shocking boldness of it should have sent her running. But it didn't. It was the certainty in his voice, the unwavering conviction. It was the most solid, real thing she had heard in 2 years. "And if I can't?" The words tumbled out, the secret fear she'd carried even when Thomas was alive. "If I can't give you children? If my body fails?" His answer came without a second of hesitation. "Then we'll face that together, the way married people are supposed to. But I've seen how you care for your animals, how you fight to make that dead soil grow. You have the heart of a mother, Mrs. Marsh. I have faith your body will follow where your heart leads." She turned away, looking out at the failing homestead that was her whole world. The morning light was cruel, exposing every flaw, but Ephraim wasn't looking at the flaws. He was looking at her. "People will talk," she said, her voice small. "People always talk," he countered. "The question is, do you care more about their opinions than about your own survival?" She faced him again, studying the raw power and determination in his face. He made it all sound so simple. "I'm not a poet, Mrs. Marsh," he said, his voice softening just a fraction. "I won't write you sonnets, but I will work beside you. I will protect you. I will provide for you. And when you're ready, truly ready, I will love you with everything I have." The promise, so stark and fierce, made her throat tighten. It wasn't a promise of romance. It was a promise of loyalty, of strength, of survival. "How long?" she asked. "For the wedding? As long as you need, but winter is coming fast. I'd rather have you safe in my house before the snows make the passes impossible." His practicality was a strange kind of comfort. He wasn't thinking about a wedding. He was thinking about her safety. 1 week, she heard herself say. The words were out before she could stop them. His eyebrows shot up. You're certain? No, she admitted, the honesty of it a relief. I'm not certain at all, but I am certain that another winter alone in this place will be the end of me, one way or another. And I'm certain you're offering me a chance to live instead of just surviving. A slow smile touched his lips. Then 1 week it is, if you'll have me. I'll have you, she said, extending a trembling hand. He took it, his massive palm engulfing hers. His touch was warm and surprisingly gentle. But I have conditions. Name them. I keep this house, she said, her voice gaining strength. For now. I need to know I have a place to come back to, if it doesn't work out. Agreed, he said without hesitation, though I suspect you'll find my house more comfortable, especially come January. His eyes held hers. My property is about 20 miles north, in the foothills just below Eagles Pass. Eagles Pass. The name was a shard of ice in her heart. The place where Thomas had died. It felt like a cruel joke, or a terrible omen. I've been building the house for 3 years, he continued, oblivious to her turmoil. Always with the thought that someday I'd have a wife to share it with. And now you will, she said, her voice hollow. Now I will, he confirmed. He released her hand, but his gaze was possessive, intense. I want you to know, Mrs. Marsh, Delilah, I don't take this lightly. When I give you my name, it's for good. Once we're married, once you're carrying my child, there's no going back. You'll be mine, and I'll be yours, for better or for worse. The raw possessiveness in his words should have terrified her. But it didn't. It sent a strange, forbidden thrill through her veins. When was the last time anyone had wanted to claim her so completely? I understand, she said, and this time she meant it. He nodded, satisfied. I'll speak to Reverend Morrison this morning. 1 week, Delilah, 1 week, and everything changes. He rode away, leaving her on the porch with her world spinning. 1 week, she would be Mrs. Ephraim Cutter, and by winter, if this impossible man was right, she would be carrying his child. She clutched Thomas's ring in her hand, the cold metal a link to her past. But for the first time, she was looking toward the future, a future that was both terrifying and filled with a strange, wild hope. She was making a deal with a giant, and she could only pray it wasn't a deal with the devil. The news of their impending wedding hit the small town of Redemption like a thunderclap. Delilah might as well have announced she was growing a second head. The very next morning, before the frost had even melted off the porch steps, Martha Henley was there, her face a storm of disbelief and concern. Are you going to tell me what's going on? Martha demanded, planting her hands on her hips. Or are you going to let me hear from Mrs. Patterson at the general store that you've lost your mind? Delilah sighed, setting down the petticoat she was mending. He's asked me to marry him, Martha. Marry him? Martha's voice shot up an octave. Delilah, you've spoken maybe 2 words to that man in your entire life. We've spoken enough, Delilah said, her voice flat. And I've accepted. Martha's mouth opened and closed. She sank onto the porch step, her usual composure gone. The grief has finally addled your brain. That's the only explanation. My brain is fine, Delilah snapped, a rare show of anger. My circumstances, however, are not. She gestured vaguely at the crumbling homestead. Look around, Martha. Just look. How bad is it? It's bad enough that I won't survive another winter alone. It's bad enough that marrying a stranger feels like the sanest choice I've made in 2 years. The anger drained out of her, leaving only a hollow ache. Martha's expression softened, the hard lines of judgment melting into worry. Oh, Delilah, she said softly. Tell me about him. Not the stories. The man. He's direct, Delilah said, picking at a loose thread on her dress. Honest. He wants children, and he thinks I can give them to him. He's offering me a home, Martha. A real home. Security. And what are you offering him? Martha asked, her eyes sharp. The question twisted in Delilah's gut. What was she offering? a worn-out widow with calloused hands and a heart that was still buried with another man. Whatever he needs, she said quietly. A wife, a mother for his children, someone to stand beside him. And love? Martha pressed. What about love, Delilah? What about it? Delilah shot back, the words like stones. Love didn't keep Thomas from freezing to death in that pass. Love didn't fix this roof or put food on my table. I still love Thomas. I will always love Thomas. But Thomas is dead, and I am alive. And Ephraim Cutter is offering me a way to stay that way. They sat in silence for a long moment, the cool morning air thick with unspoken fears. When? Martha asked finally. 1 week. Martha's eyebrows nearly flew off her forehead. 1 week? Delilah, that's barely enough time to… To what? Delilah interrupted, standing up, too restless to sit still. Plan a party we can't afford? Buy a dress I'll never wear again? What's the point in waiting, Martha? To give myself time to back out? To let the fear convince me I'm making a mistake? And are you? Martha's voice was gentle now. It was the question that had haunted Delilah's sleep. Was she trading one prison for another? Was she being fair to this strange giant man, marrying him with a ghost in her heart? I don't know, she admitted, her voice cracking. But I know what happens if I do nothing. I know what winter looks like when you're alone. And I can't face it again. I just can't. Understanding dawned in Martha's eyes. She nodded slowly. What do you need me to do? The simple, unconditional offer of help brought tears to Delilah's eyes. Just stand with me, she whispered. Be my witness. Of course, Martha said, squeezing her hand. But Delilah, afterwards, when you're Mrs. Ephraim Cutter living 20 miles away in those mountains with a man you barely know, what then? I don't know, Delilah said honestly. I suppose I'll learn to be someone new. The next few days were a blur. As they packed up the few belongings Delilah could call her own, Martha discovered Thomas's unfinished rocking chair in the back room. The wood was sanded smooth, a testament to hours of loving work. He was making it for the children we were supposed to have, Delilah said softly, her fingers tracing the curved armrest. The sight of it was a physical pain. What will you do with it? Martha asked. A strange thought, a wild impulse took hold of her. Take it with me, she said, a new resolve in her voice. Maybe Ephraim can finish what Thomas started. The symbolism hung in the air between them, heavy and profound. She was asking one man to complete the dream of another. On the day of the wedding, Martha helped her dress. Her best blue wool, a lace collar from her mother, and a pair of borrowed pearl earrings. She looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. There was color in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes. It wasn't happiness. It was sheer, terrifying hope. The church was surprisingly full. It seemed the whole town had turned out to witness the spectacle. Ephraim was waiting at the altar, looking impossibly large and uncomfortable in his Sunday best. But when he saw her, his face transformed. The hard lines softened, and his pale eyes lit up with something that looked like awe. You're beautiful, he murmured as she took her place beside him. The ring he slipped on her finger wasn't gold. It was silver, thick and heavy, with strange, intricate engravings that seemed to swirl and move in the light. It looked ancient, primal. She had a fleeting, bizarre thought that he had forged it himself, in a fire on a mountaintop. When the Reverend Morrison said, "You may kiss your bride," Ephraim's huge hands framed her face. The kiss was soft, reverent, a promise. But underneath it, she felt a tremor of something else. A banked fire. A deep, possessive hunger that sent a jolt of heat straight through her. At the reception in the church hall, she could feel the whispers. The town women watched them, their eyes sharp and calculating. "They're wondering if you're already carrying his child," Martha whispered in her ear. "The speed of this whole thing has set tongues wagging." The thought made Delilah's stomach clench. Tonight she would be in his house, in his bed, miles from anyone. Tonight the terms of their bargain would be met. The ride to his property was long and silent, taking them higher and higher into the foothills below the dreaded Eagle's Pass. The air grew colder, the landscape more rugged and wild. This was a place for a man who wasn't afraid of being alone. "There," he said finally, pointing. Through a thick stand of pine, she saw smoke rising from a chimney. Home. The house wasn't a primitive cabin. It was a fortress, built of massive, honey-colored logs with a wide porch and a stone foundation that looked like it could withstand a siege. It was beautiful. Solid. Safe. "I told you I built it for the wife I hope to have one day," he said, helping her down from the wagon. His hands on her waist felt like iron bands. "I wanted it to be worthy of her." Inside, a massive stone fireplace dominated the main room. The furniture was handmade, simple but clearly the work of a master craftsman. It was clean, orderly, but it had the sterile feel of a place that was waiting to be lived in. He showed her to the master bedroom. The bed was enormous, a four-poster he must have built himself to accommodate his frame. It was covered in quilts of deep blue and green. The sight of it made her mouth go dry. This was it, the place where her new life would truly begin. He left her to settle in, his quiet consideration a stark contrast to his intimidating presence. Alone in the room, she unpacked her few meager belongings. And then she saw it. On the small dressing table by the window, there was a Bible. It was old, the leather cover worn and cracked. She moved towards it as if in a trance. She opened it to the front page, to the family record. And she saw her mother's handwriting. It was her family Bible, the one she'd been forced to sell to pay off Thomas's debts after he died, the one she thought she'd never see again. How? How could it be here? Ephraim was a man of secrets. He had watched her, learned about her life, her poverty, and now this. He had somehow found and bought back the most precious thing she had lost. Was it a gesture of kindness, a demonstration of his power and reach? Or was it something else, a warning, a message that he knew everything about her, that there was nowhere she could hide? She stood in the silent, imposing house, clutching her mother's Bible to her chest, and a new, chilling thought crept in. She hadn't just married a stranger. She had married a man who seemed to know all her secrets, and she didn't know a single one of his. The discovery of the Bible sent a tremor of unease through her. When she confronted him, holding the book like a shield, he was maddeningly calm. "Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house mentioned you'd had to sell some family items," he explained, shrugging as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "I asked around, found the man who bought it. A woman should have her mother's Bible when she's starting a new family." His thoughtfulness should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like a cage closing around her. He saw her not as a partner, but as a project. A broken thing he was systematically fixing. He'd repaired her home, promised to fill her womb, and now he was returning the pieces of her past he deemed worthy. What part of her would be left when he was done? The days settled into a strange rhythm. He was a man of quiet habits and immense competence. He rose before dawn, tended his livestock with a gentle authority, and worked his land with a tireless strength that was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Delilah, in turn, fell into the role of wife, transforming his sterile bachelor quarters into a home. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She played her part in their bargain. She discovered he was a man of contradictions. He was blunt and practical, yet he had carved the wooden spoon he used for his stew with tiny, intricate flowers along the handle. He spoke of children with a matter-of-fact certainty, yet he never pushed, never demanded. Their nights together were filled with a surprising tenderness, a patient exploration that was a world away from her fumbling, duty-bound encounters with Thomas. Ephraim seemed determined to teach her that pleasure was her right, not just a byproduct of procreation. But despite the growing comfort, the house held its secrets. One afternoon, while Ephraim was out checking his fences, she gave in to a nagging curiosity. At the end of the main hall was a heavy oak door that was always closed. She'd assumed it was a storage room, but she'd never seen him enter it. She tried the handle. It was locked, a locked door in her own home. The thought sent a prickle of fear down her spine. What was he hiding? Was it something from his past? Something to do with the rumors of Giant's blood and his mysterious origins? She found an old set of skeleton keys in a kitchen drawer and, after several fumbling attempts, the lock clicked open. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed the door open. The room was not a storage closet. It was a nursery. It was perfect. A sturdy cradle, sanded but not yet stained, stood in the center. A small chest of drawers was painted with cheerful bluebirds. A set of tiny, carved wooden animals sat on a shelf. He had built it all. He had been preparing for their child long before he had ever spoken to her. The sheer, staggering weight of his hope, his certainty, was overwhelming. This wasn't just a bargain for him. This was his entire dream, and she was the vessel he had chosen to carry it. The pressure was immense, suffocating. She backed out of the room, locking the door behind her, her mind reeling. He wasn't just a man who wanted a son. He was a man obsessed with the idea of a family, building a shrine to a child that didn't even exist yet. What would happen if she failed him? What would this patient, gentle giant become if his one great dream was denied? The knock came a month later, on a gray November morning when the first snow was beginning to dust the high peaks. It was Samuel Morrison, the banker from town. He looked grim, his face etched with worry, and he held a thick manila envelope in his hand. "Mr. Cutter, Mrs. Cutter," he said, his voice heavy. "I'm sorry to disturb you. There's a matter of some urgency." Ephraim stood beside her, a solid, unmovable presence. "What is it, Samuel?" Morrison opened the envelope and spread a set of legal papers on their kitchen table. "It concerns the estate of Thomas Marsh." Delilah's blood ran cold. "Thomas's debts were all settled. I lost the homestead, but everything was paid." "That's what we all believed," Morrison said, his eyes full of pity. "But it seems there was another debt, one that wasn't recorded at the time." He slid a document across the table. It was a promissory note, for $800, signed by Thomas Marsh. $800? Delilah whispered, the room tilting around her. "That's impossible. He would have told me." "The creditor has come forward," Morrison continued, his voice low. "A Mr. Jonathan Blackwood from Rapid City. He's demanding immediate payment of the principal plus 2 years of accumulated interest. The total is now just over $1,000. $1,000, an impossible, life-destroying sum. And if the debt isn't paid?" Ephraim's voice was dangerously quiet. Morrison couldn't meet their eyes. He stared at the papers on the table. "Mr. Blackwood has the legal right to claim assets of equivalent value. Since the debt belongs to the estate of Thomas Marsh, and Mrs. Cutter, as his widow, inherited that responsibility, the obligation now legally transfers to your household." "What assets is he claiming?" Delilah asked, dread coiling in her stomach. She already knew the answer. Morrison finally looked up, his expression one of profound apology. "This homestead, Mr. Cutter. Your house, your barn, your land. Mr. Blackwood's legal assessment values the property at approximately $1,200. It would satisfy the debt." The silence in the kitchen was absolute. It was broken only by the sound of Delilah's own ragged breathing. It wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. This Blackwood character had waited 2 years. He had waited until she was no longer a destitute widow with nothing to her name. He had waited until she had married a man of property. Her past hadn't just followed her. It had come to destroy her future, and in doing so, it was going to destroy Ephraim. The beautiful, solid fortress he had built, the home he had offered her, the very foundation of his dreams, it was all about to be ripped away. Because of her. The moment the banker left, the fragile piece of their home shattered. Delilah sank into a chair, the weight of the disaster crushing her. $1,000 debt, 10 days to pay it. It was a death sentence for their future. "I'm so sorry, Ephraim," she whispered, the words choked with tears. "I swear to you I never knew. Thomas never said a word." She expected anger. She expected blame, the cold fury of a man who had been cheated. She braced herself for the end of their strange, delicate arrangement. Instead, he knelt beside her, his huge hands covering hers. He forced her to look at him, and what she saw in his eyes stunned her into silence. It wasn't anger, it was a calm, cold fire, a terrifying resolve. "This is not your fault, Delilah," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You did not sign the note." "But it's my past. It's Thomas's mistake, and now you'll lose everything because you married me," she cried, the guilt a toxic flood. "I've brought you nothing but ruin." "Look at me," he commanded, his grip tightening slightly. "This house is wood and stone. The land is dirt. It is not everything. It can be replaced." He leaned in closer, his pale eyes burning with an intensity that silenced her protests. "When I married you, I made a vow, for better or for worse. I did not think the worst would come so soon, but here it is, and we will face it, together." "How?" she sobbed. "We don't have $1,000. We have nothing." He stood up and began to pace the kitchen, his powerful frame seeming to fill the entire room. He was a caged lion, radiating a dangerous energy. "The signature on that note," he said, more to himself than to her. Morrison said it was verified. "A handwriting expert in Sioux Falls confirmed it," she said miserably. "Experts can be wrong, or they can be paid," he mused, stopping to stare out the window at the land that was about to be stolen from them. He was quiet for a long, tense moment. When he turned back to her, he had made a decision. "We'll sell the cattle," he announced. She stared at him, uncomprehending. "What?" "The herd, all of them. We'll sell them. It will be enough to cover Blackwood's claim." "Your cattle?" she gasped. "Ephraim, no! That's your entire livelihood. You've spent years building that herd. You can't sacrifice it for a debt that isn't even yours." "I can and I will," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. "The animals are mine to sell." "But then what? We'll be left with nothing. We'll lose the house anyway if we have no way to survive the winter." "If we pay the debt, we keep the house," he said, his logic brutal and simple. "We keep the land. We will be poor, but we will have a roof over our heads. We will have a place to start again. I will find work. I will trap. I will hunt. We will survive." He came back to her, his face set like stone. "I will not let this man take my home." His willingness to sacrifice everything, to throw away years of his life's work for her, for a marriage that was barely a month old, was staggering. It didn't make sense. The bargain had been for him to provide for her, not to bankrupt himself for her. "Why?" she asked, her voice a raw whisper. "Why would you do this?" He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his formidable armor. She saw a flicker of something that looked like desperation. "Because this is my home," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "Because I will not be driven from it. Not by this man. Not by anyone." He took her hands again, his grip almost painful. "We will fight this, Delilah. We will pay the debt, and we will stay. This is not the end of our story." But as she looked into his fierce, determined eyes, a terrifying new question began to form in her mind. His sacrifice was too great, his determination too absolute. It wasn't just about protecting her or honoring a vow. It was about the house, the land. There was something about this specific place, this fortress he had built in the mountains, that he would do anything to protect. What was he so desperate to hide? What secret was buried here, a secret so important that he would beggar himself to keep it? The locked nursery door flashed in her mind, the strange engravings on her silver wedding ring, the rumors of his mysterious past. The debt was a disaster. But she was starting to realize it might not be the real threat. The real danger might be the man she had married. The next few days were a living nightmare. Word of the Cutter cattle sale spread like a plague through the territory. Men who had been Ephraim's friends and neighbors became vultures, circling his property, their eyes filled with a mixture of sympathy and predatory greed. They knew it was a distress sale. They knew he was desperate. Delilah watched from the kitchen window as Ephraim, his face an unreadable mask of stone, negotiated away his life's work. He sold the animals he had raised from calves, the ones he had named, for prices that were an insult. With every handshake, a piece of their future dissolved. Yet he showed no emotion. He was a general sacrificing his army to save the kingdom, his resolve absolute and terrifying. Martha Henley arrived on the third day, her face grim. "The whole town is talking," she said, finding Delilah packing their belongings into trunks, a grim reversal of her arrival just weeks before. "And something isn't right, Delilah." "What do you mean?" Delilah asked, her hands stilling. "This Blackwood fellow," Martha said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "Why now? Why wait 2 full years after Thomas died to make his claim? Why wait until you married a man with assets?" "I've wondered the same thing," Delilah admitted. "It's more than that," Martha pressed. "Carl has been asking around, quietly, you understand. No one, and I mean no one, remembers Thomas ever mentioning a loan from a man in Rapid City. Thomas was a talker, Delilah, a worrier. If he was in that deep, he would have confided in someone. In Carl, at least." A fragile spark of hope flickered in Delilah's chest. "You think the debt is fake? But the signature—" "Handwriting can be forged," Martha said, her eyes sharp. "Especially by someone who knew what they were doing. Someone who might have had access to bank records, to examples of Thomas's real signature." Suddenly the world seemed to shift, to realign into a new, more sinister pattern. A forger. A scheme. This wasn't a random tragedy. This was an attack. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of an approaching carriage. It was too elegant, too fine for the rugged mountain roads. A thin, pale man in an expensive city suit stepped out, looking around with an air of smug ownership. "That must be him," Martha whispered, her voice laced with venom. "Blackwood." Ephraim met him in the yard. From the window, Delilah could see the tension crackling between the two men. Blackwood gestured dismissively at the house, a smirk on his thin lips. Ephraim's massive frame went rigid, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. He was a volcano about to erupt. Then, Ephraim turned and strode towards the house. "Delilah!" he called, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Mr. Blackwood has some questions for you." Standing before Jonathan Blackwood was like facing a well-dressed snake. His eyes were cold and reptilian, and they slid over Delilah, assessing her, dismissing her. "Mrs. Cutter," he said, his voice a silky, condescending drawl. "A pleasure. I do hate to be the bearer of such unfortunate news. Business, you understand." "My husband never mentioned you," Delilah said, amazed at the steadiness of her own voice. Ephraim's quiet strength was flowing into her, a silent current of support. "If he had taken such a loan, I would have known." Blackwood smiled, a patronizing, infuriating expression. "Perhaps he was shielding you from the harsh realities of finance, my dear, a common failing of devoted husbands." "No!" Ephraim's voice cut through the air like a whip. "A common failing is for a man to hide his cowardice behind false documents." Blackwood's eyes narrowed. "I don't care for your tone, Mr. Cutter. The debt is legal. The signature is authentic. The witnesses are prepared to testify." He pulled a gold watch from his pocket. "And the clock is ticking. 6 days. I suggest you don't waste them on baseless accusations." After he left, the air in the yard was thick with poison. "He's lying," Delilah said, the conviction a certainty in her soul. "The way he looked at the house, it was more than just business." "I agree," Ephraim said, his jaw tight. "Martha is right. This is a deliberate attack. I'm riding to town now. I'm wiring the territorial marshal. We are opening an investigation." While he was gone, Delilah wandered through the house that felt more like a prison than a home. The hope Martha had given her was a fragile thing, easily crushed by the weight of their deadline. An investigation would take weeks, months. They only had days. She found herself standing before the locked nursery door. This time, she didn't hesitate. She used the key, her hands shaking, and pushed the door open. The secret room, the shrine to a future that was turning to ash. And then she saw it. In the corner, half hidden by a canvas sheet, was Thomas's unfinished rocking chair. The breath left her body in a painful rush. Ephraim must have brought it from her old homestead. He had saved it. But why? Why bring this ghost into the house, into the very room meant for his own child? She ran her hand over the smooth, sanded wood, over the familiar curves that Thomas's hands had shaped, and her fingers brushed against something that wasn't wood. Tucked deep into a join where the arm met the back was a small, folded piece of paper. It was old, yellowed, and brittle. Her hands trembling so badly she could barely unfold it, she read the words written in Thomas's familiar, looping script. It was not a letter. It was a list of names, and the last name on the list was Ephraim Cutter. The world dissolved into a roar of white noise. Thomas had known him. Her dead husband had known the man who had claimed her, the man who had vowed to give her his son. Their meeting wasn't a coincidence. His proposal wasn't an act of desperate loneliness. It was a plan. Every moment since he had ridden up to her homestead replayed in her mind, twisted into a new, monstrous shape. His knowledge of her life, his vow, his desperation to have a son, his obsession with this house. He hadn't come to save her from her past. He had come because he was part of it. She heard his horse in the yard. She heard his heavy footsteps on the porch. The door opened. He stood there, her giant, her protector, her husband. And she looked at him, at the man who had lied to her from the very beginning, with the terrible, sickening certainty that she was married to a monster, and she had no idea what he was truly capable of. She confronted him in the doorway of the nursery, the folded piece of paper clutched in her hand like a weapon. The air crackled with tension. The last rays of the setting sun sliced through the windows, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like devils on the walls. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice shaking but clear. She held out the paper. He looked from her face to the list in her hand, and for the first time since she'd met him, his mask of calm indifference shattered. A flicker of something, shock, fear, regret, crossed his face before he could suppress it. He knew exactly what it was. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "In Thomas's chair," she shot back. "The chair you brought here. The chair you hid in the secret room you built for a child we may never have. He knew you, Ephraim. My husband knew you. You lied to me." "Delilah, it's not what you think," he began, taking a step towards her. "Don't!" she cried, stumbling back. "Don't touch me. You stood on my porch and pretended you were a stranger. You let me believe you were some lonely giant who chose me for my strength. But it was all a lie. You sought me out. Why? What did Thomas have to do with you?" He closed his eyes for a moment, a deep, shuddering sigh escaping his massive chest. When he opened them again, the raw power was gone, replaced by a weariness so profound it seemed to age him by a decade. "It's complicated," he said. "I have time," she retorted, her voice dripping with ice. "Our home is about to be stolen. My husband is a liar. I think I can handle complicated." He leaned against the door frame, the wood groaning under his weight. "Thomas and I, we weren't friends. We were partners in a venture that went bad." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture far uglier than she could have imagined. "A venture? What kind of venture?" "Land speculation," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Up in the Black Hills, there was a gold strike rumored. We pooled our resources, bought up claims. Thomas, he was the money man. He handled the financing. The names on that list are the other investors he brought in." "So the debt is real?" she whispered, her fragile hope of a forgery collapsing. "No," he said, looking up, his eyes pleading with her to believe him. "The debt to Blackwood is a fraud, a complete fabrication, but the other debts, the ones to the men on that list, those are real. Thomas used their money, and he lost it all." She sank onto the edge of the cradle, the smooth wood cold against her legs. "He lost everything?" "The gold strike was a bust. The land became worthless overnight. Thomas was ruined. He was terrified. He'd lost his own savings, and he'd lost the money his friends and neighbors had trusted him with." Ephraim's voice was heavy with a sorrow that felt genuine. "He was a good man, Delilah, but he was proud. He couldn't face them. He couldn't face you. He made a promise to me before he what? Before he went up to Eagle's Pass that day. Ephraim said quietly. He knew the storm was coming. He knew he might not make it back. It wasn't just an accident, Delilah. He was running from his failures, from his shame. The revelation was a punch to the gut. Thomas hadn't just frozen to death. He had chosen it. He had walked into that blizzard as a way out, leaving her to face the wreckage of his choices. "And his promise?" she asked, her voice numb. "What did he promise you?" "He made me swear that if anything happened to him, I would find a way to make it right, to pay back the men he had wronged, and to look after you." So that was it. His proposal wasn't a bargain for a son. It was the fulfillment of a deathbed promise. He hadn't chosen her for her strength. He had been assigned to her. She was a duty, a burden. "So you decided to marry me?" she said, the words bitter. "To take on his greatest debt as your own? Was that part of the deal?" "No," he said, his voice rising with passion. "That was my idea. It was the only way. I watched you for months, Delilah. I saw you struggling, losing everything. I knew you would never accept charity, but if I made you my wife, if I made your well-being my responsibility, then I could protect you. I could honor my vow to Thomas without wounding your pride." "And the son?" she asked, the word like poison on her tongue. "Was that part of your noble plan too? To give me a child to tie me to you? To ensure I would never leave?" Pain flashed in his eyes, so raw and real it startled her. "No," he whispered. The son was for me. That was the only selfish part of it. I've been alone my whole life, Delilah. A giant, an outcast. The one thing I've always wanted, more than land, more than money, was a family, a child of my own. I saw you, and I saw a woman who could be a wonderful mother. I hoped we could build something real out of the wreckage of Thomas's life." He finally looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "I lied to you, Delilah. I lied by omission, and I am sorry for it. I was a coward. I was afraid that if you knew the truth, you would turn me away, and I couldn't bear that. But everything I have done since the moment I stepped on your porch has been to protect you, and I have grown to care for you more than I ever thought possible." The raw honesty of his confession disarmed her. The anger, the betrayal, it all began to dissolve, replaced by a confusing swirl of pity, gratitude, and a flicker of something warmer. But the threat of Blackwood still loomed over them. "It doesn't matter," she said, her voice hollow. "None of it matters if we lose this house." "We will not lose this house," he said, his old resolve returning. "I sent the wire to the marshal, but I also sent another one, to a man in Denver, an old friend, the best investigator I know. I told him to find out everything he can about Jonathan Blackwood. We are not just defending Delilah. We are attacking." He crossed the room and gently took the list from her hand. He looked down at the names, his expression grim. "These men, Thomas's investors, they are good men. They deserve to be repaid, and I will repay them. But Blackwood is a vulture, feeding on the dead, and I am going to tear him out of the sky." The sheer ferocity in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He was no longer just her gentle giant. He was a man with a dark past, a complex web of obligations, and an enemy he was preparing to destroy. She had thought her life with Thomas was simple. She was beginning to realize that her life with Ephraim Cutter was going to be anything but. And the most terrifying part? She wasn't sure she wanted to run anymore. She wanted to stay. She wanted to see him fight. The days leading up to the deadline were a tense, agonizing crawl. Ephraim was a storm cloud of contained energy, spending hours in the barn, sharpening tools, mending harnesses, preparing for a future that was hanging by a thread. He spoke little, but his eyes were constantly on Delilah, a silent question in their depths. "Do you trust me?" She didn't know the answer. Trusting him felt like stepping off a cliff, but not trusting him felt like giving up. The telegram from Ephraim's investigator in Denver arrived on the 8th day, a lifeline thrown into their sea of despair. The man, a former Pinkerton agent named Silas Kane, was brutally efficient. His message was short and cryptic, but it electrified the air in their small kitchen. Blackwood, not a lender, a vulture, buys debt for pennies. uses forgery and intimidation, often targets widows. Signatures from bank clerk, Henry Walsh, fired for embezzlement. Walsh now in Denver. I have him. He has him, Ephraim breathed, the paper trembling in his massive hand. The forger. So the note is fake, Delilah whispered, the relief so intense it made her dizzy. It's more than fake, Ephraim said, his eyes gleaming with a cold, hard light. It's a conspiracy. Blackwood didn't just happen upon Thomas's name. He sought it out. He must have known Thomas was financially ruined, that his estate was vulnerable. But how? Henry Walsh, Ephraim said, the name like a curse. The bank clerk. He had access to everyone's accounts. He knew who was in debt, who was struggling. He fed the names to Blackwood. A knock on the door made them both jump. It was Carl Henley, his face flushed with excitement. He burst in without waiting for an invitation. We found him, Carl announced, waving a piece of paper. A cousin of mine in Denver. He tracked down Henry Walsh to a gambling den. The man is a mess, terrified. He confessed everything. It was happening. The tide was turning. He said Blackwood has been doing this for years, Carl continued, catching his breath. But he said your case was different. Blackwood was obsessed with this property. He wanted it badly. He paid Walsh double to make sure the forgery was perfect. Why? Delilah asked. Why this house? Before Carl could answer, another rider appeared, coming up the mountain road at a gallop. It was the territorial marshal, William Hayes, flanked by 2 deputies. The law had finally arrived. Marshal Hayes was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same rugged landscape he patrolled. He listened intently as Ephraim and Carl laid out the evidence, the confession from Walsh, the report from the investigator. We've been building a case against Blackwood for months, Hayes admitted, his expression grim. He's slippery. But this is the nail in his coffin. He looked from Ephraim to Delilah, his gaze lingering on her. But there's a piece of this puzzle you're missing. We found it in Blackwood's records when we arrested him this morning. What is it? Ephraim demanded. Blackwood wasn't just a random predator, the marshal said slowly. He had a partner, someone who fed him information about Thomas Marsh, someone who knew about the failed land speculation, someone who knew about the other debts. Delilah's heart hammered against her ribs. Who else knew? The marshal looked at the list of investors, the one Thomas had written, which Ephraim had handed him. He tapped one of the names with his finger. This man, he said. He was Blackwood's informant. He sold out Thomas and every other man on this list, hoping to get his own investment back when Blackwood seized the property. Ephraim and Delilah leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the name the marshal was indicating. It was Carl Henley. The world stopped. Delilah stared at Carl, who stood frozen by the fireplace, the color draining from his face. Her friend, her neighbor, the man who had just ridden here pretending to be their savior, Martha's husband. Carl? Delilah whispered, the name a strange, foreign sound. It's a lie! Carl stammered, his eyes wide with panic. Blackwood is lying to save his own skin. We have letters, Marshal Hayes said, his voice cold as steel. In your handwriting, detailing Thomas's finances, urging Blackwood to act quickly after the widow remarried. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from Delilah's lungs. All those visits from Martha, all her concern, her advice. Was it all an act? Was she in on it too? The thought was too monstrous to bear. Martha, Delilah began, her voice trembling. She didn't know, Carl cried, his composure finally breaking. He sank to his knees, his face crumpling. I swear it, she knew nothing. I was ruined. Thomas ruined me. I have 2 sons, a wife to provide for. I just wanted my money back. Blackwood promised. He promised no one would get hurt. Ephraim took a single, menacing step towards him. The floorboards groaned. He was no longer a man. He was an avalanche, an earthquake. He was vengeance personified. You set this vulture on my wife. Ephraim's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that shook the very foundations of the house. You stood in my home and pretended to be my friend. You let your own wife comfort mine, while you plotted to see us thrown out into the snow." He reached down and hauled Carl to his feet with one hand, lifting him until his toes barely scraped the floor. Carl choked, his face turning purple. "Ephraim, no!" Delilah screamed, rushing forward and grabbing his arm. It was like trying to stop a runaway train. "Don't! He's not worth it! Let the law handle him!" For a long, terrible moment, she thought he was going to kill him. She saw the raw, primal fury in his eyes, the giant's blood of the old stories boiling to the surface. But then he looked at her. He saw the terror on her face, and something inside him shifted. The rage receded, replaced by a cold, contemptuous disgust. He dropped Carl to the floor in a whimpering heap. "Get him out of my house," he said to the marshal, turning his back on the broken man. As the deputies hauled Carl away, Delilah was left shaking, her mind reeling from the layers of betrayal. But through the shock, one thought burned clear. Ephraim. He could have destroyed Carl. He had the power, the rage, the justification, but he had stopped. For her. That night, after the storm had passed, they sat before the fire in the home that was truly, finally, theirs. The threat was gone. Blackwood and Carl would face justice, but the revelations of the day had changed everything. "I'm sorry," she said quietly into the silence. "About Carl. About Martha." "Martha is your friend," he said, his voice gentle again. "She is as much a victim in this as we were." "He could have killed him," she said, looking into the flames. "Today. You could have." "Yes," he admitted without hesitation. "But you didn't." He turned to look at her, his expression searching. "No, I did not." She finally understood. The source of his strength wasn't his size or his mysterious past. It was his control. It was the love he felt for her, a love so powerful it could tame the monster within him. She went to him, knelt before his chair, and took his huge, calloused hands in hers. They were hands that could build or destroy, that could kill or protect, and they had chosen to protect her. "I was wrong about you," she whispered, looking up into his pale, beautiful eyes. "You're not a monster, and you're not just a man fulfilling a promise to the dead. You are the best man I have ever known." A tear escaped his eye and traced a path through the grime on his cheek. He had wept for nothing, not for the loss of his cattle or the threat to his home. But he wept now, at her words. "And you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "are the only woman I have ever loved." The words were a key, unlocking the final, stubborn door to her heart. The ghost of Thomas, the grief, the fear, it all washed away, leaving only the man in front of her, her husband, her Ephraim. She leaned in and kissed him, a kiss not of passion or duty, but of pure, profound love. It was a promise of her own, made not in desperation, but in glorious, earth-shattering certainty. But as she held him, a final, nagging question surfaced. Carl had said Blackwood was obsessed with this property, that he wanted it badly. Why? It was good land, a strong house. But was there more to it? Was the story truly over? Or had they just defeated one enemy, only to learn that a greater, unknown threat was still out there, waiting in the shadows? The secret of the house, she realized, had not yet been revealed. In the weeks that followed, a fragile peace settled over the homestead. The legal nightmare was over. Carl Henley had been disgraced, and Martha, heartbroken and ashamed, had retreated from society. Delilah found she felt only pity for her friend. The ordeal had forged a new, unbreakable bond between Delilah and Ephraim. Their nights were filled with a deep, trusting intimacy, and their days with the shared work of rebuilding. Ephraim found work hauling timber for the new railroad line, his immense strength making him invaluable. The money was slow, but it was a start. They were poor, but they were together, and their home was filled with a quiet, hard-won love. Delilah threw herself into making the house a true home. She planted a garden, she painted the nursery a cheerful yellow, and she finally took Thomas's rocking chair from the shadows, placing it by the fireplace. It was no longer a ghost. It was a memory, a part of the strange path that had led her to happiness. One evening, Ephraim came to her with a small, heavy pouch. "I have something for you," he said, a nervous energy about him. Inside was a ring, not her plain silver wedding band, but a magnificent gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond that glittered like a captured star. It was an antique, clearly a family heirloom. "It was my grandmother's," he said, his voice soft. "She brought it from Norway. She made my grandfather promise it would only go to the woman I chose to love, not the woman I was obligated to marry, but the woman I truly loved." He slipped it onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "That woman is you, Delilah." Tears filled her eyes. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. As she admired it, her fingers traced the intricate filigree on the band, and she felt it, a tiny, almost imperceptible seam. A catch. Curious, she twisted the setting. With a soft click, the diamond popped open on a minuscule hinge. It was a locket ring, and inside, nestled in the tiny compartment, was not a portrait or a lock of hair. It was a minuscule, tightly folded piece of vellum. Her fingers trembled as she used a needle to carefully extract it. Unfolding it, she saw it was a map, a crude, hand-drawn map of their property. It showed the house, the barn, the creek, and it showed something else. A spot, deep in the woods behind the house, marked with a single, strange rune. It was the same rune that was engraved on her silver wedding ring and on his grandfather's watch. "Ephraim," she whispered, her blood running cold. "What is this?" He looked at the tiny map, and a slow, sad smile touched his lips. "That," he said, "is the secret of the house. The reason my family came to this mountain. The reason Blackwood was so desperate to get his hands on it." He took her hand and led her outside into the twilight. He grabbed a shovel and a lantern from the barn, and together they walked into the deep woods behind their home, following the path on the tiny map. They came to a small, secluded clearing, dominated by a cluster of ancient, moss-covered stones. "My grandfather didn't come to America to be a farmer," Ephraim said, his voice a low thrum in the quiet woods. "He came following a story, a legend passed down through our family for generations. A story of a treasure brought over by Vikings who explored these lands 1,000 years ago and buried for safekeeping." He stopped at the center of the clearing and drove the shovel into the soft earth at the base of the largest stone. Blackwood must have gotten his hands on a copy of the legend somehow. He didn't want the house, he wanted what was under it. He dug for nearly an hour, his powerful muscles working with a steady rhythm. Delilah watched, her heart pounding, the lantern light casting flickering shadows around them. Finally, the shovel hit something hard with a dull thud. Working together, they cleared the dirt away, revealing the lid of a heavy iron-bound wooden chest. It was ancient, the wood warped and the iron fittings green with age. It took all of Ephraim's strength to pry the lid open. Inside, nestled on a bed of rotted cloth, was a king's ransom. Gold coins, some bearing the faces of forgotten Roman emperors, others stamped with the same strange rune as the map. Jeweled goblets, a heavy gold torque. It was a Viking hoard, a mythical treasure hidden for a millennium in the heart of the Dakota wilderness. Delilah stared, speechless. It was impossible. It was a fairy tale. "This changes everything," she breathed. "Yes," Ephraim said, looking not at the gold, but at her. "The debts to Thomas's partners can be paid. We can buy back the cattle. We can build a life our children will never have to worry." But as she looked at the treasure, a sudden, chilling realization dawned on her. This hoard was not just a blessing. It was a curse. It was a secret that people would kill for. Blackwood had been the first. Would he be the last? Ephraim seemed to read her mind. "No one else knows," he said firmly. "The legend dies with me. We will use what we need to build our lives, and the rest will remain here, a secret between us, our children, and the mountain." He closed the lid on the ancient chest, and together they reburied it, hiding the evidence of its existence beneath the earth and leaves. They walked back to the house in silence, the weight of their secret a tangible thing between them. They were no longer poor. They were guardians of a fortune beyond imagination. But they were also keepers of a dangerous secret. Their simple life was over. That spring, just as the first green shoots were pushing through the soil, Delilah knew. Her monthly courses, always so cruelly punctual, were late. A week passed, then two. Martha, now a tentative, cautious friend once more, came to the house with a knowing look in her eye. She was pregnant. When she told Ephraim, he didn't shout with joy. He simply went very still, his face pale. He came to her, knelt before her, and gently laid his hand on her still flat stomach. And he wept. Not with the sorrow she had seen before, but with a joy so pure and profound it seemed to shake his entire giant frame. His promise, the one that had started it all, had finally come true. By spring, not winter, she carried his child. Their son, Eric, was born in late summer, with a shock of golden hair and his father's pale blue eyes. He was perfect. Holding him in her arms, Delilah knew a love so fierce it eclipsed everything that had come before. Ephraim was a doting father, his massive hands surprisingly gentle as he held his tiny son. The lonely giant was gone forever, replaced by a man who had found his purpose. Their life became a quiet rhythm of love and family. They paid Thomas's debts anonymously, sending gold to the families he had wronged through a lawyer in a distant city. They bought back their cattle and expanded their homestead. They were prosperous, but they lived simply, their great secret buried deep in the woods. Delilah knew that the treasure was still a danger, a shadow that would always lurk at the edge of their lives. But looking at her husband and her son, she knew they could face anything together. They were a family forged in secrets, tested by betrayal, and bound by a love that was stronger than any Viking gold. The desperate widow and the lonely giant had found their treasure, but it wasn't the one buried in the ground. It was the one they had built together, in a house on a mountain, a fortress of love against the harshness of the world. And that was a story worth telling. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss the tale we have coming for you tomorrow.